When did asking a question become more offensive than refusing to answer one? Have you ever had a question that you were afraid to ask? Not because you didn't want the answer, because you already knew what might happen if you asked it. Maybe someone would call you ignorant. Maybe they would accuse you of being hateful. Maybe they would say you're spreading misinformation. Maybe you'd be labeled a conspiracy theorist. Or maybe people would simply tell you, stop asking questions and just trust the experts. But here's the problem. Questions are not automatically dangerous. Sometimes questions are exactly how we find the truth. So why have many people become afraid to ask them? Think about a child. A child asks questions constantly. Why is the sky blue? Why does this happen? Where did this come from? Why can I do that? We don't usually punish children for being curious. We understand that questions are a part of learning. But somehow along the way, many adults learn something different. They learn that certain questions are acceptable and other questions can come with consequences. And that's where the problem begins, because there is a huge difference between asking a question and making an accusation. There's a difference between saying, is this true? And saying, this is definitely true. There's a difference between what evidence supports this and I already know you're lying. A healthy society should be able to handle the first question without automatically assuming the second. Sometimes people don't fear questions. They fear where the questions might lead, because a legitimate question can challenge an assumption that someone has held for years, and that can be uncomfortable. Imagine someone saying, why do we do things this way? That sounds harmless. But if the answer is because we've always done it this way, then the question has exposed weakness. Or imagine asking, what evidence do we have? If the evidence is strong, there shouldn't be much to fear. Show the evidence, explain it, let people examine it. But if simply asking for evidence causes anger, that's when we should become even more curious. Not because anger proves someone is wrong, it doesn't. People can become angry for many legitimate reasons, but anger also shouldn't be used as a substitute for an answer. If the evidence is strong, explain the evidence. One of the easiest ways to shut down a conversation is to attack the person asking the question instead of addressing the question itself. You don't have to answer someone if you can discredit them first. Call them stupid, call them hateful, call them crazy, call them a conspiracy theorist, call them a racist, call them a troublemaker, and suddenly the conversation isn't about the question anymore. It's about the person. This happens across politics, it happens in relationships, it happens in religion, it happens in the workplace, it happens online, and it happens on both sides of the political cultural spectrum. That's important because this isn't about one political party. It's about human behavior. People tend to defend ideas they identify with. And when the idea becomes part of someone's identity, criticism of the idea can feel like criticism of the person. That's when intellectual curiosity can turn into tribalism. If you're questioning my side, you're against my side. But that's not how truth works. Truth doesn't belong to a political party. Truth doesn't belong to a race. Truth doesn't belong to a religion. And the truth certainly doesn't belong to a social media algorithm. Now add social media to the equation. Social media rewards certainty. Think about it. A complicated explanation doesn't always go viral. A dramatic accusation does. A calm discussion doesn't necessarily generate thousands of comments. Conflict does. Algorithms don't need you to be correct. They need you to keep watching. So people learn to speak in absolutes. This proves nothing. They're lying. Everybody knows. There's no question. But real life isn't always that simple. Sometimes the truth is we don't know yet. And there's nothing wrong with saying that. In fact, admitting what you don't know can be a sign of intellectual honesty. A mature person should be able to say, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, here what is alleged, and here what still needs to be proven. That isn't weakness, that's responsible thinking. Now, there's another distinction. Just because you question one explanation doesn't mean you automatically accept another explanation. If I say, I'm not convinced by that explanation, I haven't necessarily said, therefore, this completely different explanation must be true. There can be a third position. I don't know yet. That's one of the most important phrases we've lost. I don't know. We shouldn't be embarrassed to say it. We shouldn't be pressured to immediately pick a side because sometimes the honest answer is uncertainty, and uncertainty can be the beginning of an investigation. Now, let's be fair. Questioning everything doesn't automatically make someone intelligent. You can ask a question in good faith, or you can ask questions simply because you want to reinforce something you already believe. There's a difference. If you're asking questions, you also have to be willing to hear answers you don't like. You have to explain evidence that challenges your position. You have to admit when you're wrong, and you have to understand the suspicion is not proof. That's the other side of intellectual freedom. You have the right to question, but you also have the responsibility to think critically about what the answers are. So why are people afraid to ask questions? Sometimes it's fear of rejection. Sometimes it's fear of being judged. Sometimes it's fear of losing friends. Sometimes it's fear of challenging a group they identify with. And sometimes it's simply easier to repeat what everyone else is saying. But we have to be careful because a society that cannot tolerate questions eventually becomes a society that discourages curiosity. And once curiosity disappears, independent thinking becomes much harder. We shouldn't be afraid of questions. We should be afraid of a culture where questions are automatically treated as attacks. The answer to a difficult question shouldn't be censorship. It shouldn't be name calling. It shouldn't be intimidation. It should be evidence, reasoning, conversation, and more questions. Because if something is true, asking questions shouldn't destroy it. It should make the truth stronger. So I'll leave you with this. What questions have you been afraid to ask because you already knew how people would react? Put it in the comments. And remember, questioning is an enemy of truth. Sometimes questioning is how we find out.